Hi, I'm Andy Pressman, Agriculture Specialist with NCAT's ATRA program, and I'm with Shane LeBrake, Farm Educator and Farm Equipment Educator, and in this segment we are going to learn about changing the fuel filter.
Indeed, let's go do it. So again, we are working on a Ford 1910 model from 1985, and the type of fuel filter on this is common to many tractors, though not the only type that exists. It's important to realize that again, as we've said so many times, it's important to read your manual and understand what your particular machine requires for the project, for the services that you are about to do. This is a canister style filter that has it's a canister, I should say, that has a filter inside of it. And the filter is a paper cartridge. Could you open that for us, Andy? So we have a plastic canister that we'll be removing, and a filter that has an opening at the top, no opening on the bottom, and this is going to slip up onto a nipple that comes down in that the fuel comes through and gets filtered before going into the fuel injection pump. So this comes between the fuel tank. It's directly after the tank. There's a little fuel line going over to it and then goes out into the fuel injection pump. So before we do anything, we're actually going to shut off the fuel line. And another thing that's important is to find out whether or not the bleeding of the system, which happens at the whole end of changing the fuel filter, requires a certain amount of fuel in the fuel tank of the tractor. So we've checked that. It could be a little more full, but I think we've got enough on this particular job to bleed the system out once we've changed the filter itself. For this particular fuel system, we have our tank here with the fill cap there. There is a line coming from the bottom of the tank into the fuel filter, and this is what we're going to be working on and replacing with a new filter. There is a cutoff valve right here, and before we remove this plastic canister, we're going to shut off the fuel supply. Obviously, we don't want fuel running through here once this is all disassembled. And we have to first shut this off, remove this ring. This is a retaining ring. So we're going to use a wrench to get that off. Carefully lower this plastic cup into our drain pan and pour off any diesel fuel that's in there. Remove the old filter, which is inside, and replace it with this new filter. Reinsert the canister in the ring, open that, and then we're going to have to bleed this system by opening a couple of bleed screws, and we'll explain that when we get closer to the project. An important thing to keep in mind when you go to do this project is that when we remove that ring and that cup, there's going to be diesel fuel spilling out. And for a novice who's never done this before, unless they really like the smell of diesel fuel, they're going to on their clothes and on their skin, they're going to want to be very careful as they bring that down and pour it off. So you'll notice I'm wearing nitrile gloves for this project, and I'm going to be very alert where that cup is as it's coming off so I don't get my sweatshirt saturated with diesel fuel. It may have happened in the past. I'm ready to start this project, and the first thing I'm going to do is shut off the fuel valve. So I just turned that. In this particular system, it's a 90-degree turn. It can go either way, so I hope it's correct. We'll find out soon enough. And now I'm going to use that same oil filter wrench that I like so much to loosen this retaining ring. And that loosened up nicely. So I've got it free. I can now do everything else by hand. And again, with this loader frame in the way, everything's a little tricky. So the ring's coming off nicely. Okay, I'm going to drop that down and put it someplace safe. And here's the moment of truth. I'm going to free up this canister. Oh, we've definitely got some gunk there. And we certainly have the fuel line shut off properly. That's nice to know. And here's our old filter. And you can see there's gunk up at the top, some sediment, probably rust from the fuel tank. And I'm going to pour off this diesel fuel. And we have a spring at the bottom, and our manual said nothing about that. And we also have an O-ring going around this canister. And in an ideal world, when we purchased the filter, our parts person would have said, would you like the O-ring for that goes with it? If you don't know this, when you go to buy your filter, please ask your parts person, is there an O-ring for the canister if you have this type of system? Now, we have to be very careful with that because that's the only one we have. And we'll see too that there's a whole lot of gunk down in here. And what we want to do now is clean that out of there before we put this all back together. So a little diesel fuel spilled onto the frame of the tractor here. We'll clean that up before we put everything back together. And we'll go clean this up. And I want to point out one other thing that we don't know about yet, because I have to look for this. There was nothing in the manual about this, but experience from other tractors that use a similar type of filter system typically have a tiny O-ring that's on the downspout coming down from the canister top. And this indeed does. I can feel it. And again, this is the kind of thing where having a good parts person to tell you or ask you when you buy the filter, do you want the 2 O-rings that come with that? We should ideally replace both when we're doing a fuel filter change. And I have found from experience the best tool that works for getting those off is an old dental pick. Because you've got to reach up in here. It's a little tricky to do with your fingers. A knife will work, and if you're going to replace it anyway, you can cut it off if you have to, but it fits into a groove. So you've got to slip it out of the groove and then slip the new one on, and that would be the ideal.
Okay, Shane, so we've pulled off the old filter, we've cleaned out the sediment bowl, and I see you've got the new filter in hand.
Yep, I'm ready to go. So there was a spring located at the bottom of this, and I hate to keep dwelling on this in these little instructional videos that we do, but the manual did not mention the spring, and it did not mention the O-rings. So if you're a total novice working on these things, it's important to recognize that the manual only tells you so much, that there's things you're going to learn about just by doing it. Oh, it didn't say anything about that spring. And of course, when you're pouring this old fuel off, when we remove this, if you were pouring that into a 5-gallon bucket or something that had other mucky stuff in it, and you didn't realize the spring was down the bottom, or that it might be down on the bottom, you just lost an important part of this whole system. So those are things you really want to be careful with when you're doing jobs like this for the first time on a tractor you've never worked on before. So another thing I'll point out is that some of these canisters for the fuel filter will have a plastic float ring in it, and that's a water indicator. Water is denser than fuel, and if you have moisture accumulating in your fuel tank, part of the purpose of this fuel filter is to capture that. So what would happen is, as water sits in this whole system, the water is denser than fuel, it settles into the bottom, and if you have one of those little plastic rings, they float on the water, and you're able to visually see, assuming your canister is clear enough, that you've got water at the bottom. Some fuel filters will even have a little valve down here that allows you to drain that water off. So there's a number of different ways that these have been configured over the years. All right, we're going to go ahead and put this back on, and it involves a few steps. We have to put that spring down in the bottom, and there's actually a little tab down there that this mounts into. So we want to kind of get that to line up. So we have our spring. This is going to go on top. This can only go one way. This has to go up onto that nipple with that little O-ring we mentioned that rests on top of the spring. So that's going to go like that. And then we have to pay attention to this O-ring that I mentioned earlier. That's going to go there. And so I'm ready to do the reassembly. So first thing I'm going to do is coax this up onto the nipple that's underneath. And again, we're reusing the O-ring that was in place. We didn't replace it. That should hold. And then I'm going to very carefully bring this up into place, trying not to move that spring. And then, now an important step here is to make sure that all the contacts are secure, clean, and tight, and that when you re-thread the retaining ring, that nothing is cross-threaded. So I need to inspect around the ring. Since it's a very awkward space to work in, I'm a little concerned that the tightening of this retaining ring might be a little off. It doesn't feel like it's off, meaning it's cross-threaded, but it's hard when you can't see clearly and you're relying entirely on feel to make sure. It feels good. So with this wrench again, I'm going to just tighten it down, snug it down. I don't want to over tighten this, but I want it to be good and snug. And so what's the correct snugness, you ask? Well, experience kind of tells you. You want to get it snug and yet not have to put tremendous bodily force on it. So like, I'm getting to a point where with just moderate effort, I can't really get any more purchase. Well, it could be where my wrench is. So it feels pretty darn good to me, like it's where it needs to be. And we want this tight because if it's not tight, we're going to be leaking fuel, and we don't want to do that. All right, I think that's in position. And know how clean this is now? I would take a rag to this regularly and just keep it clean. It allows me to see through it a little bit better. So we are now ready to try bleeding out the system as I wipe away some diesel fuel. And it's always good to blot, that is to say, to take your rag and wipe the surfaces where any diesel fuel may have dripped as the filter was off, so that when you go to test for leaks, you're actually not seeing just drips from what leaked out when it was off, when the canister was off. Okay, I think that's good. I'm also inspecting the exposed threads all the way around that I can see, and just see that they look like they line up and that it's even, and it does, so I feel okay about that. All right, so next thing to realize is that the bleeding system, or the method for bleeding out the fuel lines, is different on pretty much every machine that you got to work on. And you really need to rely on your manual for this to know what you need to do to bleed the system. And when we say bleed the system, what we're talking about is we just allowed air into the fuel lines that go into the fuel injector, and we have to bleed out that air. Even though we need air for combustion, we don't want it mixed with the fuel before the proper time. So there's a prescribed method for bleeding, and I always reference the manuals before doing this because I I know that pretty much every single method or system is a little different. So for this one, we just installed a new element, so we're required to do it. We need to make sure there's adequate fuel, and then we're going to open the fuel shutoff valve. So just go down here, open this up, and we're going to open the bleed screws at the top of the filter, this one here. We're going to open that. And when we do that, it looks like we should see some air bubbles. And then we also need to open up another bleed screw on the fuel pump. So we're ready to bleed this, and this is the first bleed screw here. And this is a 10 millimeter. You could either use a 10 millimeter wrench, or you could try using a Phillips head screwdriver. And what we're going to do is we're going to open this up, and in theory, if there's enough, already I can see bubbles starting to form on my left hand side from opening this up. So we're going to open that up a little bit more, and that means that fuel is probably rushing in, and we're going to start to see fuel oozing out here. In theory, we should. Let me get down here. Oh yeah, this is filling up with fuel. The canister is filling up slowly, and as it comes up to the top, we should start seeing some fuel dribbling out of that loosened screw. You don't take it all the way out. There we go. You can now see this coming out, and you see air bubbles popping out, and we're going to just let that bleed out a little bit until it's straight fuel like we're seeing now, and then we just close that up. Now you would also have to know how to do this if you ran out of fuel out in the field because you didn't fill up your fuel tank before starting work. And when you run out of fuel, not only do you have to bleed, but in some cases you may have to prime the tank, and it can be a real challenging situation to try and get an engine started that's been run completely dry of fuel. And this is another 10 millimeter. So both are 10. This is it, right, Andy? This is what you... So we'll open that up, and there's fuel coming out. And that looks like a steady stream. Close it up. And tighten everything down. So this is messy, folks. You definitely want to wear nitrile gloves doing this job. And be prepared for diesel fuel spilling around and maybe getting a little on your clothes. And at the end of all this, I just want to take a rag or paper towels or some sort of absorbent material and wipe away all the diesel fuel that just spilled out. Now we're not done, because we need to actually start the engine.
Well, Shane, I've learned a lot today on routine tractor maintenance. Anything else I should know before we leave for the day?
Well, I think the key takeaways, Andy, are that we know we need good clean air and good clean fuel for combustion. So addressing things like the air filter and fuel filter on a regular basis better ensure good combustion in the combustion chamber of the engine. And that changing the oil and the oil filter regularly is also extremely important for good lubrication. we need to have good lubrication of all those precisely machined moving metal parts inside the engine block. It's so critical to have good lubrication. And then last, today we addressed blowing clean with the air compressor and the blowgun, the radiator fins, the radiator screen. That's also very important because the engine has to run cool. It's really important that the engine run cool and be well lubricated. And if you keep an engine running well by running cool, being well lubricated, good clean air, good clean fuel, you'll go a long, long way in keeping that engine running well for a lot longer. The real issue here is maintaining good compression on diesel engines. And in terms of interventions that people can do in their own daily routines and daily work, this type of service is really critical.
Well, Shane, I definitely feel empowered to do my own routine maintenance now, and thank you so much. It's been a great day.
It's been a great day and a real pleasure to work with all of you. Thank you.